Hello, everyone. Let's talk about World War II and Black people in the American context, and we'll also talk a little bit about globally. Um, it is important to note when we talk about Black people's involvement in World War II, we have to look at the invasion of Ethiopia. In 1935, Ethiopia was invaded by Italy, and African Americans lobbied for American involvement. In fact, African Americans actually traveled; many of them traveled to Spain in order to fight against Italy. This goes back very far to African American culture and heritage. Ethiopia has always been held in high regard throughout the African diaspora as a um, symbol of African independence, as a symbol of African ancestry and heritage. So African Americans had lobbied very hard for America to get involved and enlisted themselves to fight. However, Adolf Hitler and Mussolini wanted to take economic and political control of Europe. And in 1939, Germany attacked Poland and Britain, and uh, and Britain and France, they entered World War II. Japan wanted to extend its power throughout Asia and wanted the U.S. out of Asia and bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in 1941. Now, after Pearl Harbor, the United States reduced its previous restrictions on African American involvement in military service, and they entered into World War II. As far as African Americans and their involvement, more than 1 million African Americans fought in the U.S. And in the armed forces in World War II. Many refused. So this is very important because it would set a trend. Because it was in 1942 that Elijah Muhammad, who brought he brought the Nation of Islam to national prominence. But in 1942, Elijah Muhammad refused to register for the draft and was arrested. Even the NAACP was a part of the national effort to call on Black people to fight in World War II, to prove their citizenship, to prove manhood, to prove their commitment to democracy. And indeed, many of them fought in World War II expecting to receive full citizenship for their proud service. But of course, they ran into discrimination. In the military, Black soldiers were treated worse than German prisoners of war were treated. In fact, William Hastie, who was an aide to the Secretary of War, actually resigned because of the failure of the U.S. military to implement non-discrimination policies in the military. It was at this time that Roosevelt was pressured by A. Philip Randolph, pressured to pass Executive Order 8802. And that executive order was for non-discrimination in the defense industry, and that was about jobs. So in the 1940s, there was defense spending. They had to make planes, they had to make weapons, they had to make guns, they had to make armor, tanks, equipment. And this defense spending, it created a lot of jobs. It actually brought the United States out of the Depression, the amount of spending that was done on defense industry, jobs in aircraft factories, shipyards, and other forms of war production. So many Black farmers left their land for urban areas to make money in the defense industry, and many industries relaxed their restrictions on Black workers. Los Angeles, for example, saw its African American population increase by more than 340,000 during the war. And due to the war, approximately 1.6 million African Americans left the South, going to the North and places in the West like Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, what impact that this has? It caused riots across the country, like in Detroit, where there were issues between black and white um, people around racism, housing discrimination, economic discrimination, and police brutality. But fundamentally, behind it was racism and economic competition. So there were these racial tensions, again, primarily around jobs, housing, racism, and hot button issues like police brutality. There was another impact that's very important. Um, World War One, it brought a lot of French West Africans to France to establish a large African presence there. Now, Africans were used in British and French armies in World War II as well to work in the war industry. The important thing to remember is that many of the soldiers brought from Africa to fight or work in the war industry never returned to the African continent. So you have people who, you have African people who went to British controlled areas around the world in order to fight on the side of um, Britain and the United States, what was known as the Axis powers, and to fight in World War II against Italy and Germany. And so the result is these African diasporic populations in places like India, in Sri Lanka, throughout Europe. Okay, so the creation of African diasporas that already existed grew, and new diasporas were created based on military. Another impact that World War II had on Black people was politicization. Many of the young militant Blacks of the Civil Rights Movement, which is more than 20 years away at this point, many of those young Black militants of the Civil Rights Movement were the children of Blacks who had gone off and fought in World War II. Black men who fought in the war, they returned home with a new sense of confidence, pride, and camaraderie. They fought for freedom abroad, and they returned home ready to continue the fight for justice, racial justice. So you had Black veterans like Medgar Evers, who channeled that new consciousness towards civil rights organizing. You had Black people who had been told that they were fighting for democracy abroad. And upon returning home, they still had to fight, encountering the same racial violence and systemic exclusion from jobs and schools as before. So Black people have once again been confronted with the contradictory values around the US war effort, and their lack of equality at home. It also inspired a sense of Black nationalism. And nationalism is a social thought, is a practice that's centered around the concept and the conviction that Black people are a unique people. That people of African descent are a unique people who have unique concerns and needs and have the right and responsibility to unite and to meet those needs and interests. It also sparked Pan-Africanism. W.B. Du Bois was known as the father of Pan-Africanism. And Pan-Africanism is thought and practice that's directed toward liberation of an entire African continent. Globally, it represents the liberation, the unity, the mutual support of African descended people throughout the world. So nationalism is a part of Pan-Africanism. In fact, Du Bois, he directed the 1945 Fifth Pan-African Conference and was known again as the father of Pan-Africanism. And this conference took place in Manchester, England. It brought together a lot of African nationalist leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, um, of course, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya. And they would go on to be the independence leaders of Ghana and Kenya. So World War One had already brought a lot of Africans to Europe, and um, many had studied at universities in Europe, and they'd started a West African student union, actually. Um, but when World War II broke out, many of them wanted to return to liberate their home countries. They had fought in this war for liberation, for freedom, for liberty. And that made them want to return to their home countries in Africa to fight, to liberate them as well, to fight for independence. Others stayed and worked in the reconstruction industries in Europe because after the war, there was so much damage that there was an entire industry around rebuilding. Many African people stayed to work in that reconstruction industry in Europe. And at that Manchester conference, Pan African and independence ideas were spread.